Thanks for watching. What I'd like to do in this video is to look at the importance of taking a technically good image and the creative freedom that that image can give us when we get it open into Lightroom for editing. I shot some images of an osprey in flight recently to illustrate a video I was making on the Canon RF 70-200mm f2.8 lens. I'll link to that video below. A 70-200mm lens may be considered a moderate focal length for shooting birds in flight. But these ospreys are pretty big birds. But in an ideal world, we'd still like to get just a bit closer to our subject if we could. But we are in the hands of the wildlife gods here. And this is as close as I could get with the lens zoom to 200mm. To give the image more impact, one solution would be to crop into the image in Lightroom to give the bird a greater size within the image frame. To be able to do this and retain quality, the image we start with needs to be technically good, with the bird critically sharp and noise kept to a minimum. Because whatever we do as we zoom into this image, we're going to make both of those issues worse. We do have quite a number of things in our favour to achieve this, especially when we're using the Canon R5 and the 70-200mm f2.8 lens. A 70-200mm lens is much easier to handle than say a 100-500 f7.1 lens, or maybe something similar. The 2.8 aperture allows us to gather in lots of light, which in turn allows us to keep the shutter speed high. That aperture also allows us to keep the ISO down. The result is that we capture a sharper, lower noise image. The in-body and lens stabilization coupled together helps to keep camera shake under control. In bright conditions, a shutter speed of around 6,400ths of a second is achievable, and that's a pretty good place to start. Finally, we have 45 million pixels to play with, which means we can discard quite a number of them and still be left with millions more. The image I'd like to use was shot at 200 ISO with a shutter speed of 6,400ths of a second at f4. It may have been marginally better had I reduced the ISO from 200 to 100 and then compensated by opening the aperture from f4 to f2.8. After all, depth of field isn't an issue here, and we may have reduced noise just a little more, but it would have been minimal. Let's take a quick run through the camera settings. I set servo focus so the lens continually focuses while the button is pressed, and I also use this in conjunction with the back button focus option. From the Q menu on the back of the camera, I set the large zone autofocus horizontal. Keep that shape over the bird, and the Canon R5 will focus on what's within it. In the main autofocus menu, I select subject to detect, and I set that to animals. The drive mode is set to high speed continuous, and with big birds like these, I see little advantage to using the electronic shutter at 20 frames per second. I choose a lens stabilization mode too. Now that's probably best for panned subjects where we're going from, in my case, right to left. And I used a manual exposure. So our first task is to select an image we're going to work on. I'm going to use the one you can see highlighted here. There is a couple of other shots which show the bird just a little bit closer to the camera, but I quite like the shape of the wings here, so I'm going to select this image and open it up into the Develop module. Now the first thing to do is just make sure that the image we've picked is sharp enough. So I've zoomed into the head. I can see the head and the eyes are nicely sharp. So I'm happy to proceed with this one. So the first thing we need to do is to crop the area we wish to use. Selecting the crop tool, I'm going to drag in the edges here, and we'll drag it all and get it into place. What I'd also like to do is to give the bird a nice angle in the frame. So I'm gradually zeroing in here. Now you can see I'm looking for the wings to cross these strong areas. I've got the bird on that bottom horizontal line. I could possibly bring these in a little bit. You get the idea. Now we're taking quite a small amount of the image. So let's have a look and see what we're going to get when I touch the Enter key. So one of the first things we may want to do is to zoom in and take a look at the damage, so to speak, which isn't bad at all. Now I've zoomed in to 200% here. We can see a little bit of noise in the sky. We can't see very much in the bird, but there's going to be a little bit there. So one of the first things we need to do is go straight to the Detail tab here. And I'm going to put a degree of noise reduction in here. And I'm going to put it up to about 25. Oh, that's a little bit too far. Well, I'll go up a little bit higher than I really should. And the problem with that is it does make the background a little too smooth and takes away all of the noise. And that makes the picture look a little cartoon-like. I found that a setting of around 20 to 25, somewhere around there, seems to work best because it does a great job with the reduction in noise, but it doesn't take it away completely, so the image looks natural. Now we've got to lift the tones in the underside of the bird. So one of the ways we may think about doing that is using one of the new masks. Let's go up and select the masks. And the one we may turn to first, of course, is Select Subject. Let's do that and see what Lightroom does. Now, when I've done this in Adobe Camera Raw, I've got the same result. It's done a pretty good job, but we can see there's a problem within the feathers at the tips of the wings. Nothing we couldn't deal with. We could select one of the options to subtract, maybe select that with a brush, and we could spend some time cleaning up between these feathers at the wingtips, but there's a better way. Let me right click and delete that mask because we can fool the software just a little bit here, because if we select the sky, once we see the overlay, you can see it does a much better job than selecting the subject. So all I've got to do now is go over to the right hand side and invert that. There we have the bird nicely selected, but we don't have any other work to do. Now I'll just turn that overlay off and we'll go down to the shadows and we'll lift those. So that's going to bring the underside of the wings. I think we can squeeze a bit more. Maybe a little bit of exposure too. And I would like to add just a little warmth. I'm going to do that with the temperature here. Not a lot, but just a little. Now we've got the opportunity, of course, to look at things like clarity, even texture. All these are going to be more personal than right or wrong. But if we look at the image, it's already looking pretty good. We've got a couple of weak areas though. We've got a nice bright eye on the right side of the bird's left eye, but the other one's in shadow, and if I can see clearly enough, it's looking a bit blue to me. So I think what I'd like to do next is to deal with that eye on our left-hand side. To do that, I'm going to zoom in right on the bird's face, and this is the area I'm talking about. You can see we've got warm tones here because the light's coming from that way, but in the shadow areas it's going a little bit blue, which is quite natural. So what I'm going to select here is my brush. I'm going to go back to my masks. I'm going to select a brush. And we can just do the masking first if we wish. Looking over to the right hand side, you can see the flow rate is around about 30%, or 30 from 100, I suppose that is 33%. Dropping the brush size down, I just want to lift the tones around this area. Just around here. But I quite like to see the effect of what I'm doing as I do it. Let me demonstrate that by removing the overlay, by going back to the options here, moving up the shadows, maybe a little exposure too. Remember, we can always tweak these back if we go too far, and trying to do something with the warmth there, or the coolness, by warming it up to match the right hand side. And now I can go back and I can just do a little bit of masking, and I can see exactly what I'm doing as I'm doing it, which I find a little bit easier to do. I still think that could be warmed up a bit more. Doesn't seem to be having a great deal of effect. Let's try a bit of saturation as well. I think that's going to do the job. Now, while we've got the bird zoomed in, we've got some weakness in the light tones around the head. So we could deal with those, and we could use exactly the same tool. So let's go back to the options of the mask, click and add a brush. What do we want to do here? Well, I want to take down the highlights a little bit and the exposure a little bit. I think I'd zoom in a little more, so I'm going to select, let's try 300. That looks okay. Let's make my brush as small as I can get it. Something like that, because I just want to go around the edge there, just to darken these areas down. And you can see I'm working quite delicately here. I don't want my flow rate of this tool, this brush, to be too high, because if it is, it'll run away with me. When I get round to this larger area, I'll bring my brush into the sky so you can see it. I can make it slightly bigger. Then I can bring it down onto the highlights and brush down. And you can see how effectively we can deal with all of these tones. And I could make my, whoops, I've hit the wrong key there, ignore that. If I drop down the size of the brush, I probably could do with a little more work around the edge, and I may even, in the real world, push this up a little bit bigger just to do that. But once I've done that, let's fit this back on the screen. There's not a great deal more we need to do, but maybe we could do something with the eyes. So once again, we could do with zooming in on the image, so let's do that. I'll go into, what have we got there, 300%. That looks perfect. I'm going to select yet another brush. I'll leave the overlay here so I can just paint it in. Now this is where we could push up the flow if we wanted to, but just be a bit careful you don't go too far over the edges. Whoops, I've moved it a little bit. I'll hit Ctrl Z. If you pick up the pins, of course, you can move the entire area you want to mask. Let's remove the overlay, because what I'd like to do here is to warm up the temperature to put a bit of glow in those eyes. Maybe drop the exposure a little bit in the eyes just to add a bit more impact, and maybe even push the saturation just to get something sparkling. The eyes are very small when we zoom out, so I think we can afford to do that. Now we've got a bit of an imbalance here for obvious reasons. We've got a much nicer colour here than here. Let's see if we can make this a little bit better, but of course we're going to have to adjust it independently to the other eye, which means I'll select another brush. All of these masks can be renamed, but to be honest, because you can mouse over them and see exactly what they're going to affect, I find that's adequate for most of the images that I manipulate. But here, of course, I'm going to want to have another go at that other eye to try and get it a little bit more balanced with the more brighter and colourful one. So removing that overlay, let's push that temperature again. And the saturation again. And now we've got a nicer balance between the two. Let's tuck these away. We'll fit the image on screen and we'll take a minute's time out. Now I don't think there's too much more we would want to do with this image, but we're all going to do something slightly different. If you wanted to throw a little more light in the underside of the wings, well, you can use masks to do that. And you do have the opportunity to adjust the blue of the sky. I think the blue looks pretty good to me, but let's just select it and see what we can do. You never know until you try. So let's select the sky here. We know it's going to do a pretty good job of that. And once it's done, I'll remove that little tick and I'll just drop the temperature down towards blue a little bit, give it a bit more of a dynamic colour, but I can't stand blue skies that people oversaturate when they start to look unnatural. So I just want to tweak that very, very slightly, but nothing more than something like that. Cropping into wildlife pictures like this one is a common thing that we see quite often. But when you stop and think about it, we shouldn't be seeing this technique at all. If we can see it, and we can in a lot of cases, it indicates that either the image quality wasn't good enough to allow that level of cropping, or the cropping was taken too far for the number of pixels that the sensor had captured. If we get things right, we can often pull off a remarkable improvement. It's worth considering and setting up carefully for this type of shot, because one day the birds will fly past 3 or 4 times, some days you'll only see them once, and of course some none at all. So if and when we get a chance for a rare fly past, we don't want to miss it. Remember, you can download this video from my website to your desktop if you find that helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.